The laughter started before the champagne glasses were even cleared. Not loud laughter. Not the kind people share when something is genuinely funny. This was the uncomfortable kind. The kind people use when a wealthy man makes a cruel joke, and nobody wants to be the first person to object. I stood beside table 12 at my son's wedding reception, holding a half-finished glass of iced tea. Across the ballroom, nearly 300 guests sat beneath crystal chandeliers. The room smelled of roses, expensive perfume, and prime rib. My son Daniel looked handsome in his tuxedo. His new wife Emily looked radiant. For a few precious hours, everything had been perfect. Then Emily's father decided to remind everyone exactly where I came from. He raised his wine glass. "I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight." The guests applauded. He smiled. He always smiled before saying something unpleasant. His name was Richard Holloway. Successful developer. Millionaire. Country club member. One of those men who had spent so many years being admired that he began believing admiration was the same thing as character. The room quieted. Richard continued. "Emily has always had high standards." Polite laughter. "Which is why we're so pleased she found Daniel." More applause. Daniel smiled. Emily squeezed his hand. Then Richard looked directly at me. The smile never left his face. Of course, success doesn't always come from where you'd expect. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. I already knew where this was going. So tonight is proof that even someone raised under very modest circumstances can still achieve great things. The room became very still. Daniel's smile disappeared. Emily frowned. I felt dozens of eyes turning toward me. Richard wasn't finished. I suppose that's a tribute to determination. Another smile. Or maybe luck. Several people laughed. Not because it was funny. Because Richard Holloway was important. And important people rarely hear silence. Daniel stood immediately. "Richard?" But Richard lifted a hand. "I'm only joking. The favorite defense of every bully." I watched him carefully. The same eyes. The same jaw. The same expression. Nearly 40 years older. But unmistakably the same man. Suddenly I wasn't standing in a luxury hotel ballroom. I was standing somewhere else. Somewhere long forgotten. Somewhere called 1987. Richard looked at me again, his smile widening, though I admit it's remarkable. The room was frozen now. "A waitress raises a son who marries into this family." The words landed like a slap. My son looked horrified. Emily looked ready to cry. Richard's wife whispered something urgently. He ignored her. And that's when I finally spoke. Not loudly. Not angrily. Just calmly. "Funny." The room fell silent. Richard blinked. "Excuse me." I met his eyes. "You weren't saying that in 1987? Everything changed. Immediately." His face lost color. Not gradually. Instantly. Like someone had unplugged him. The wine glass nearly slipped from his hand. For the first time all evening, Richard Holloway looked afraid. People noticed. Every single person in that ballroom noticed. The silence became unbearable. Richard stared at me. I stared back. Neither of us spoke. Then Daniel asked, "Mom?" His voice sounded confused. "What does that mean?" I didn't answer. Not yet. Because to explain 1987, I have to tell you how this story really began. My name is Margaret Dawson. I'm 72 years old. And for most of my life I was known by a simple title. Single mother. That title sounds ordinary now. Back then it wasn't. Especially not in a small Indiana town during the 1980s. Daniel was 3 years old when his father left. No dramatic fight. No scandal. No goodbye letter. One day he simply packed a suitcase and disappeared. The child support check stopped shortly afterward. The excuses stopped too. Then the phone calls. Then everything. Leaving me alone with a toddler, a rented duplex, and more bills than money. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one winter night. Daniel asleep in the next room. $23 in my checking account. $42 due for electricity. I cried quietly because I didn't want him to hear. Then I got up the next morning and went to work. That's what single mothers do. Not because we're brave. Because nobody else is coming. For years I worked at a roadside diner called Millie's. Breakfast shift. Lunch shift. Double shifts. Holiday shifts. Any shift available. The regular customers knew me. Truck drivers. Factory workers. Farmers. Travelers. I poured coffee. Refilled ketchup bottles. Balanced receipts. And raised my son. Sometimes I brought Daniel to the diner when babysitters canceled. He would sit in a booth coloring while I worked. The customers loved him. They watched him grow up. By 1987, Daniel was 9 years old. Smart. Polite. Obsessed with baseball. Life wasn't easy. But we were surviving. Then one October night changed everything. The weather forecast predicted severe storms. Most people stayed home. Business was slow. The diner closed at 10. By 9:30, only 2 customers remained. The rain hammered the windows. Thunder rattled the building. Even Millie, the owner, left early. "Lock up when you're done, Maggie." I nodded. The storm grew worse. Sheets of rain covered the highway. The parking lot emptied. I started cleaning tables. Then the door opened. A young man stumbled inside, mid-20s, soaked from head to toe, breathing hard, terrified, and carrying something that immediately caught my attention: blood. The young man nearly collapsed before he reached the counter. For a moment I thought he might be drunk. Then I saw the blood more clearly. Not a little blood, a lot. His white shirt was stained beneath a soaked denim jacket. His hands were shaking. His face looked pale beneath the fluorescent lights. And his eyes. I still remember his eyes. Terrified people have a certain look, a look that cannot be faked. I had seen it before. Customers involved in car accidents, families rushing loved ones to hospitals, people receiving terrible news. This young man had that look. He glanced over his shoulder toward the highway, then toward the rain, then back at me. "Please," his voice cracked. "Don't call anybody." That wasn't exactly reassuring. I should have called the police immediately, or an ambulance, or both. Instead, I grabbed a clean towel. "Sit down." He hesitated. "Please." I pointed toward a booth. "Sit." Finally, he obeyed. The moment he lowered himself into the seat, I saw him wince. Definitely injured. I walked around the counter. "What happened?" He shook his head. "Nothing." I raised an eyebrow. Nothing doesn't usually bleed this much. For a second, I thought he might leave. Instead, he looked down, ashamed, exhausted, defeated, and somehow younger than I first thought. Maybe 24, 25. Not much older than a kid. The storm continued pounding the diner windows. Outside, lightning flashed across the highway. Inside, only the buzzing fluorescent lights broke the silence. I handed him the towel. He pressed it against his side, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry." "About what?" "Bleeding in your booth?" I laughed despite myself. The first genuine laugh of the evening. That surprised him. It surprised me too. Then I noticed something. His hands. They weren't rough. Not construction worker hands, not factory worker hands. His fingernails were clean. His watch looked expensive. His shoes had probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Whatever had happened, this wasn't some drifter wandering in from the road. The young man came from money, or had. "Do you need a doctor?" "No." The answer came too quickly. "Police." His face immediately tightened. "No." "Interesting. Very interesting." I sat across from him. Something told me this wasn't a criminal. I couldn't explain why. Maybe instinct. Maybe experience. Maybe because desperate people recognize other desperate people. After several moments, he finally spoke. "I'm not a bad person." I smiled sadly. Most bad people don't bother saying that. "What happened?" He stared at the tabletop. "For a very long time. Then, my life fell apart today." Not exactly an explanation, but it sounded honest. I waited. Eventually, the rest followed. Not all at once. Piece by piece. Like someone trying to rebuild a broken window from scattered glass. His father had disowned him. A business venture had collapsed. People he trusted had turned against him. Money was disappearing. Opportunities were disappearing. Everything seemed to be disappearing. The details remained vague, but the despair was obvious. At one point, he laughed bitterly. "You ever have one of those days where everything goes wrong?" I looked around the nearly empty diner, then laughed. "Only every Tuesday." For the first time, he smiled. Just a little. Then his eyes drifted toward a framed photograph hanging near the register. A picture of Daniel. Little League uniform. Huge smile. Proud mother standing beside him. The young man stared at it. "Your son?" I nodded. "Daniel." "How old?" 9. His smile faded. "You raise him alone?" I nodded again. The question seemed to affect him. He looked away. Toward the rain-covered windows. Toward the darkness outside. Then quietly said, "My mother raised me alone too." Something in his voice changed. Suddenly he wasn't talking about business failures, or money, or whatever crisis had brought him here. He was talking about something older, something deeper. Pain recognizes pain. That night I learned that. The storm trapped us inside for nearly 2 hours. By 10:30 the roads were flooded. By 11 the power briefly flickered. The young man looked exhausted. Completely exhausted. Eventually, I made him a cheeseburger, then another. He tried to pay. I refused. You don't know me. No. You don't owe me anything. Nope. He frowned. Then why are you helping me? I looked at him. Really looked at him. The fear, the loneliness, the hopelessness. And I remembered sitting at my kitchen table after Daniel's father left. $23 in the bank. No answers. No rescue coming. Just fear. Pure fear. Because somebody should. The answer seemed to hit him hard. His eyes filled unexpectedly. He looked away immediately, pretending to study the rain. Around midnight, the storm finally weakened. The roads began clearing. The young man stood, slowly, painfully. He looked better than before, still shaken, still injured. But standing, before leaving he pulled out his wallet. Inside was very little cash, far less than I expected. He counted it carefully, then stopped. Embarrassed, I reached into my apron pocket, removed $40, nearly all the tip money I'd earned that day, and handed it to him. His eyes widened. I can't take that. You can. No. Yes. Why? The question again. Always the same question. Why help someone when helping costs something? I smiled. Maybe someday you'll do the same for somebody else. For several seconds he simply stared at me. Then he accepted the money. Not proudly. Not comfortably. But gratefully. Before leaving he turned back toward me. Rain still dripped from his jacket. I'll never forget this. I laughed. You probably will. He shook his head. No. Then he added something I wouldn't fully understand until decades later. If things ever work out. A pause. I'll make it right. Then he disappeared into the storm, and I assumed I'd never see him again. For years I didn't. Until one morning almost 20 years later, I was drinking coffee before work, reading the Indianapolis newspaper, and suddenly I saw a familiar face staring back at me from the business section. A wealthy developer announcing a major expansion project. Older, heavier, more polished, but unmistakably the same man. The frightened young stranger from that stormy night in 1987, Richard Holloway. I stared at the newspaper for nearly 5 minutes. The coffee in my hand went cold. The article covered 3 pages. Photographs, financial projections, interviews, success stories. Everything modern America loves. The headline called Richard Holloway one of the fastest rising developers in the Midwest. The article described him as a self-made businessman, visionary, leader, entrepreneur. The kind of words newspapers use when someone becomes wealthy enough to be interesting. I studied the photograph again. Older face, expensive suit, confident smile. But it was him, the young man from the diner, the frightened stranger from that stormy October night, the man who had accepted $40 from a waitress because he had nowhere else to turn. I remember laughing softly, not because it was funny, because life is strange, very strange. For a moment I considered writing him a letter, just to say hello, just to tell him I was glad things had worked out. Then I folded the newspaper and went to work. Life moved on. Years passed. Daniel graduated high school, then college. He became an accountant. Not flashy, not wealthy, just reliable. The kind of man who returned shopping carts. The kind of man who remembered birthdays. The kind of man who called his mother every Sunday. I was proud of him, not because of his career, because of his character. Around the same time, Richard Holloway's name became increasingly difficult to avoid. Billboards, charity events, business magazines, television interviews. The man was everywhere. And every time I saw him, I remembered that storm. The diner, the blood, the fear, the $40. Eventually, I stopped thinking about it. The past belongs in the past. At least that's what I believed. Then Daniel met Emily. The first time he mentioned her, I knew he was serious. Parents can tell. His voice changed. His eyes changed. Even his posture changed. Love does that. One Sunday afternoon, he arrived at my house carrying a nervous smile. Mom? Yes. I want you to meet someone. A few moments later, Emily walked through the front door. She was beautiful. But more importantly, she was kind. The first thing she did was offer to help carry groceries. The second thing she did was compliment my flower garden. The third thing she did was make Daniel laugh. That was enough for me. By the end of dinner, I adored her. Over the following months, she became part of the family. Holiday dinners, weekend cookouts, football games, birthdays. She fit naturally into our lives, and Daniel had never looked happier. One evening, he invited me to dinner, just the 3 of us. Halfway through the meal, he reached into his jacket pocket. My heart immediately knew. The small velvet box confirmed it. Emily started crying. Daniel started laughing. I started doing both. They were engaged. The wedding would take place the following year. Life felt wonderful, simple, beautiful, exactly the way it should. Then Daniel showed me a photograph. The engagement party. Several family members smiling together. Emily standing beside an older couple. Her parents. The moment I saw the picture, my stomach dropped. Richard Holloway. For several seconds I couldn't breathe. Daniel noticed immediately. "Mom," I forced a smile. "Sorry." "You okay?" "Just surprised." The understatement of the century. That night I barely slept. I kept staring at the photograph. The stranger from 1987. The man whose life I had briefly touched. The man who had promised never to forget, and now his daughter was marrying my son. The odds felt impossible. The next few weeks were awkward. Very awkward. I considered telling Daniel everything. Then I remembered the promise. The young man had asked me never to tell anyone what happened. At the time, I thought the promise would last a few days, not decades. Yet a promise remains a promise. So I stayed silent. The engagement party arrived. For the first time in nearly 40 years, Richard and I stood in the same room. The moment our eyes met, I knew. He remembered. Instantly. Completely. His smile vanished. Not dramatically. Just enough. The recognition was unmistakable. Later that evening, he approached me privately. Away from the guests. Away from Daniel and Emily. Away from everyone. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said, "Margaret." I nodded. "Richard." The conversation felt surreal, like opening a time capsule. He glanced around nervously, then back at me. "You never contacted me." "No." "Why not?" I shrugged. "What for?" The question seemed to unsettle him. He studied my face carefully, searching for something. Resentment, perhaps. Expectation. Demand. He found none. Finally, he exhaled. "I've wondered about you." I smiled. "I figured you were busy." He laughed once. Short. Uncomfortable. Then silence returned. Eventually, he asked the question I knew was coming. "You never told anyone?" "No." His shoulders visibly relaxed. That reaction bothered me, more than I expected, because it suggested he had spent years worrying about it, or hiding from it, or both. Then he said something strange. "Let's keep it that way." Not a request. A warning. Subtle. Polite. But unmistakable. I stared at him. The frightened young man from the diner was gone. In his place stood someone else. Someone powerful. Someone accustomed to controlling situations. Someone worried about old truths resurfacing. And for the first time, I wondered what Richard Holloway was so afraid of. The wedding day arrived on a warm Saturday in late September. One of those perfect Midwestern afternoons that seem custom-made for family photographs. Blue sky. Gentle breeze. Sunlight reflecting off white tents and polished silverware. Everything looked beautiful. Everything felt wrong. Not because of Daniel and Emily. They were radiant. The problem was Richard. Ever since the engagement party, our interactions had become increasingly strange. Not openly hostile. That would have been easier. Instead, Richard treated me with a kind of icy politeness. The sort wealthy people sometimes use when they want someone to know they don't belong. Every conversation felt rehearsed. Every smile felt forced. Every handshake felt calculated. At first I told myself I was imagining it. Then the wedding planning began, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Whenever family decisions arose, Richard somehow found a way to remind everyone of social status. The venue, the guest list, the catering, the entertainment, the accommodations. Everything became a competition disguised as generosity. "I'll cover that." "We'll handle that." "Don't worry about the expense." Always spoken with a smile. Always designed to establish hierarchy. My hierarchy. His hierarchy. One afternoon, Emily apologized to me privately. I still remember sitting together in a coffee shop. She looked exhausted. Embarrassed. Frustrated. "I'm sorry about my dad." I smiled. "You don't need to apologize." "Yes, I do." She stared into her coffee. "He wasn't always like this." I believed her. Because nobody becomes arrogant overnight. It happens gradually. Success, recognition, power, enough years of people agreeing with you. Eventually, some people forget how to see others clearly. I reached across the table, touched her hand. "He's still your father." Tears appeared in her eyes. "And you're still one of the kindest people I know." She smiled, a sad smile, but a real one. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful. Daniel cried. Emily cried. Half the guests cried, including me. Watching my son stand at the altar brought back every memory. The tiny apartment, the late-night fevers, the little league games, the college graduation, every sacrifice, every struggle, every prayer, everything. For a few hours nothing else mattered. Not Richard, not the past, not 1987, only family. Then the reception began, and Richard decided to remind everyone who he thought he was. The ballroom belonged to an upscale hotel overlooking a golf course. Crystal chandeliers, white roses, live orchestra, 300 guests, most from Richard's world, business executives, attorneys, developers, politicians, people whose watches cost more than my first car. I didn't care. I had survived harder things than expensive people. At first, the evening went smoothly. Dinner, dancing, toasts, laughter. Then Richard stood, microphone in hand, wine glass raised. The room quieted immediately. People listened when Richard spoke. They were used to it. He thanked vendors, thanked family, thanked friends. Then something shifted. Subtly, dangerously. I've always believed success leaves clues. Polite applause. Richard smiled. And one of those clues is environment. The room remained attentive. I felt my stomach tighten, not because of what he said, because of how he said it. I'd heard that tone before, many times. The tone people use when preparing to disguise cruelty as wisdom, Richard continued. Children often become products of what surrounds them. Several guests nodded. Daniel frowned. Emily looked confused. I knew exactly where this was going. Then came the first shot. Of course exceptions happen. A smile. Sometimes people rise above their circumstances. A few uncomfortable laughs. Daniel shifted in his chair. Richard wasn't looking at him. He was looking at me. The second shot came moments later. We should all be grateful when opportunity finds deserving people. More laughter. Less comfortable now. Several guests looked away. Emily's mother appeared horrified. Richard continued anyway. Years of being admired had convinced him he could say anything. Then he delivered the final blow. The one he clearly believed would impress everyone. A waitress raises a son who marries into this family. The room froze. Even the orchestra stopped moving. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody. Daniel stood immediately. Enough. His voice echoed across the ballroom. Richard blinked. Surprised. Perhaps for the first time in years. Emily stood too. Dad. The warning in her voice was unmistakable. But Richard wasn't finished. Pride rarely knows when to stop. He shrugged casually. What? Nobody answered. Because everyone understood, including him. Then he looked directly at me, smiling, waiting, expecting humiliation, expecting silence, expecting gratitude. Instead, I slowly stood. The ballroom became completely quiet. 300 people watching. 300 people waiting. I looked at Richard, really looked at him. Not the millionaire. Not the developer. Not the public figure. The frightened young man from that stormy night in 1987. The young man who arrived bleeding, hungry, broken, terrified. The young man who accepted $40 from a waitress. Then I smiled. The same way he had smiled. Calmly, gently. And I said, funny. Richard's expression changed instantly. You weren't saying that in 1987? The color drained from his face. The wine glass trembled in his hand. A collective gasp moved through the ballroom. And for the first time all evening, Richard Holloway looked truly afraid. Richard stared at me. The ballroom stared at Richard. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed willing to breathe. The silence felt heavier than any argument. He knew. I knew. And now everyone else knew that somehow, somewhere, Richard Holloway and I shared a history he desperately wanted hidden. Daniel looked from me to Richard, then back to me. What happened in 1987? His voice sounded confused, concerned. Emily looked equally stunned. The guests were practically leaning forward in their chairs. Richard set down his wine glass. Slowly, carefully, like a man buying time. Margaret! His voice had changed. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the performance. Now he sounded nervous. Very nervous. I folded my hands. You seem uncomfortable. A few guests exchanged glances. Richard swallowed. For the first time all evening, he looked exactly like the young man who had walked into Millie's diner. Scared. Vulnerable. Lost. Not powerful. Not important. Human. Maybe this isn't the place. The irony almost made me laugh. A few minutes earlier, he had been perfectly comfortable humiliating me in front of 300 people. Now suddenly privacy mattered. Daniel stepped forward. "No." His voice was firm. "If something needs to be said, say it." The room fell silent again. Richard closed his eyes briefly. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered the look on Daniel's face when Richard called me a waitress. The embarrassment. The hurt. The disrespect. Number. This moment belonged to truth. Emily took her father's arm. "Dad." He looked at her. Then at Daniel. Then at me. Finally he nodded. A defeated nod. The kind people give when they realize the exit door has disappeared. Richard looked toward the guests. I owe everyone an explanation. Nobody interrupted. Nobody wanted to. He took a deep breath. Then another. And finally spoke. In 1987, I wasn't a businessman. A murmur spread across the room. I wasn't wealthy. More silence. I wasn't successful. Daniel frowned. Emily stared. Richard continued. I was 25 years old. His eyes drifted toward me. And my life was falling apart. The ballroom remained completely still. My father had cut me off. My business failed. I owed money. I had nowhere to go. Every sentence stripped away another layer of the image he had spent decades building. The self-made millionaire. The powerful developer. The respected businessman. Suddenly people were seeing something else. A young man who once lost everything. Richard continued. I spent months pretending I was fine. A bitter laugh escaped him. I wasn't. Then he looked directly at Daniel. One night I drove for hours in a storm. His voice grew quieter. I was injured. I was scared. I honestly didn't know what I was going to do next. Daniel looked at me, understanding slowly appearing. Richard nodded toward me. Then I walked into a diner. Every eye in the room shifted. Toward me. The waitress. The woman he had mocked. The woman he was now talking about. Richard swallowed. Your mother was working alone. No one spoke. She should have called the police. A few nervous laughs. He shook his head. But she didn't. His eyes became wet. For the first time all evening. For the first time perhaps in years. I was a stranger. I had nothing. And she helped me anyway. The ballroom remained frozen. Richard continued. She fed me. She cleaned my wound. She listened. A pause. Then came the detail that changed everything. And before I left? His voice cracked. She gave me $40. The room erupted with whispers. Not because $40 sounded impressive. Because everyone understood what $40 meant to a struggling waitress in 1987. Richard looked around. That money mattered. A tear rolled down his cheek. I know it sounds ridiculous now. No. His voice grew stronger. It mattered. He pointed toward me. She had every reason to walk away. Every reason. But she didn't. Silence. Then he laughed bitterly. And tonight I stood here pretending status makes people valuable. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. The truth was dismantling him piece by piece. And strangely, it wasn't satisfying. Not the way I expected. Because underneath the arrogance sat a frightened young man who had simply forgotten who he used to be. Richard turned toward me. In front of everyone. 300 guests. His daughter. My son. His business associates. His friends. His reputation. Everything. Then he said the words I never expected to hear. I'm ashamed of myself. The room remained silent. I've spent decades trying to become someone important. Another pause. And somewhere along the way, his voice broke. I forgot who helped me survive. Emily began crying. Daniel squeezed her hand. Even Richard's wife looked emotional. Then Richard stepped away from the microphone, walked across the ballroom, and stopped directly in front of me. The millionaire, the developer, the powerful man, standing before a retired waitress. And in a voice everyone could hear, he said, Margaret. I looked up. I'm sorry. Richard's apology hung in the air. Not because it was dramatic. Not because it was loud. Because it was genuine. For a moment, nobody knew what to do. 300 guests sat quietly in a ballroom that had transformed from a wedding reception into something far more important. A lesson. A reckoning. A second chance. Richard stood in front of me waiting. Not demanding forgiveness. Not expecting it. Simply waiting. The way people do when they finally tell the truth. I looked at him carefully. The wealthy businessman was still there. The expensive suit. The polished shoes. The success. But for the first time all evening, I could also see the young man from 1987. The frightened stranger sitting in a diner booth while rain hammered the windows. And suddenly I understood something. The real tragedy wasn't what happened that night. The real tragedy was how much energy Richard had spent trying to outrun it, trying to become someone else, trying to bury the version of himself who once needed help. I stood slowly. The ballroom remained silent. Then I smiled. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I was tired. Tired of carrying old stories. Tired of carrying old wounds. Tired of watching pride hurt people. Richard. His eyes met mine. "You don't owe me for $40. A few guests laughed softly, relieved to hear kindness entering the room. I continued. "You never did." His expression tightened. "But you did owe yourself honesty." The room became quiet again. Richard nodded. Slowly, almost painfully. "You're right." For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I extended my hand. The gesture surprised him. It surprised everyone, including me, but it felt right. After a brief hesitation, Richard shook it. The ballroom erupted into applause. Not because people love apologies, because people love redemption, especially older people. We've lived long enough to know everyone eventually needs forgiveness. Daniel walked over immediately. My son looked emotional. His eyes were red. His smile was shaky. He hugged me first, then turned toward Richard. For several seconds, nobody knew what would happen. Finally, Richard said, "I'm sorry, son." Daniel laughed through tears. "You can start by never calling my mother a waitress again." The room laughed, including Richard. Then Daniel added, "Although honestly," he looked at me proudly. "I've always been pretty proud of the waitress who raised me." That earned another round of applause. I felt tears forming. The good kind. The kind that arrive when love wins. Emily crossed the room next. She wrapped her arms around me. "I'm so sorry." I kissed her forehead. "None of this was your fault." Then she turned toward her father. For a moment I saw the little girl she once was. Not the bride, not the adult. Just a daughter. "Dad," Richard looked terrified. Emily smiled. "I love you." The relief on his face was almost comical. Then she added, "But don't ever do something that stupid again." The ballroom laughed. Even Richard. Especially Richard. The tension finally broke. Dinner resumed. The orchestra returned. Conversations restarted. People relaxed. But the evening wasn't finished. Not yet. About an hour later, Daniel approached the microphone. The room quieted again. Thankfully for happier reasons. "I think we need one final toast." Guests raised their glasses. Daniel looked at Emily, then at me, then at Richard, and finally at everyone else. "When I was growing up, we didn't have much." His voice remained calm. "But I never felt poor." I swallowed hard. Daniel continued. "Because my mom taught me something." The room listened. Character matters more than circumstances. A few heads nodded. Money comes and goes. Success comes and goes. Status comes and goes. He smiled. But kindness stays. The ballroom remained silent. The good kind of silence. The listening kind. Then Daniel looked toward Richard. And sometimes the strongest people are the ones who admit they're wrong. Richard lowered his eyes. Emotional again. Daniel raised his glass. To family, everyone followed. To humility, more glasses lifted. To second chances, the entire ballroom joined him. The toast ended with cheers, but the words stayed. Months later, the wedding would still be remembered. Not because of the flowers. Not because of the venue. Not because of the menu. People remembered the truth, the apology, the forgiveness, the lesson. A year later, Richard and I actually became friends. Not close friends, but real ones. The kind built on honesty instead of appearances. Sometimes we laughed about that stormy night in 1987. Sometimes we didn't. Either way, neither of us needed to hide from it anymore. Today, when I sit on my porch and watch my grandchildren play, I think about how easy it is to judge people by their job title, their income, their clothes, their address, and how wrong we usually are. Because the most important things about a person rarely appear on a business card. You never know who helped someone survive. You never know what battles they fought. You never know whose kindness changed a life. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly carried a family through difficult times, take a moment to tell them. Sometimes gratitude arrives decades late, but it's never too late to give it. And if you've ever witnessed the power of humility, forgiveness, or second chances, I'd love for you to share your thoughts. Stories like these remind us what truly matters. Thank you for spending this time with me.